Why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. The origins and recruitment of assassins, 1,500 to 2,000 words. You might imagine a medieval assassin as a shadowy figure, cloaked in secrecy, slipping through alleys under moonlight. Popular culture gives them daggers, poisons, and a kind of sinister glamour. But the truth was far less exciting and far more grueling. To understand why being a medieval assassin was such a miserable, dangerous, and thankless job, we first need to step back into the strange and tangled world of the 11th and 12th centuries. The group most associated with the term assassin were the Nizari Ismailis, a sect of Shia Islam that emerged in the late 11th century, centered in Persia, modern-day Iran, and Syria. Western chroniclers, especially Crusaders, gave them the infamous name Hashishin, a word later twisted into assassin. The origin of the word is debated. Some sources claim it referred to their supposed use of hashish, though scholars today doubt this story, suspecting it was a smear invented by their enemies. What we know for certain is that their reputation was built not on armies, but on targeted killings of political and religious opponents. But who became an assassin and why? Unlike the tales of elite killers chosen from birth, the reality was more mundane. Most recruits were young men with few prospects. Poverty, war, and displacement created a constant stream of vulnerable individuals. Many were orphans of conflict, peasants looking for stability, or marginal figures attracted by the promise of belonging. For these recruits, the Nizari strongholds, remote mountain fortresses like Alamut Castle, offered food, shelter, and a clear purpose. Life inside these fortresses was far from glamorous. The assassins were trained less like stealthy ninjas and more like fanatical loyalists. They learned obedience, secrecy, and a readiness to die on command. Literacy was not required. Devotion was. The leaders of the order, particularly Hassanai Sabah, cultivated absolute loyalty. They reinforced this through rigorous indoctrination, religious study, and the slow erosion of personal will. The so-called training was rarely about combat. Instead, it was about mental preparation for self-sacrifice. Unlike mercenaries, assassins were not promised wealth. Their value came from their willingness to infiltrate cities, courts, or camps, often living for months or years in disguise before striking their target. This made them vulnerable not only to discovery, but to the crushing boredom of waiting. Imagine being a young recruit, sent into an unfamiliar city, told to blend in, and given no timeline for action. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Every interaction carried risk. One careless slip of language, one misstep in local customs, and suspicion could bring torture and death. Daily life for these men was therefore a mixture of tedium and terror. On one hand, they were expected to live like ordinary citizens, perhaps working as servants, traders, or scribes. On the other hand, they carried a constant awareness that one day they might be ordered to kill, and more likely than not, to die in the process. There was no guarantee of return, no promise of survival. The reality of being an assassin was also shaped by their enemies. To Christian crusaders and rival Muslim rulers, the assassins were not mysterious figures. They were fanatical nuisances. Captured agents were tortured brutally, often executed in public to send a message. Whole communities suspected of harboring assassins were punished. The psychological burden of knowing this fate awaited you if discovered was enormous. Yet, paradoxically, the assassin's reputation made them useful. The mere possibility that one might be lurking nearby caused fear among rulers. Chroniclers record kings refusing to sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row, or avoiding large gatherings, for fear of hidden blades. This gave the assassins a power disproportionate to their numbers. But for the individual recruit, it meant living under a myth larger than life, while enduring the dreary and lonely grind of waiting, spying, and hiding. Consider the fortress of Alamut, perched high in the Elburz Mountains. To outsiders, it was the headquarters of terror. To those inside, it was a cramped, austere, and monotonous place. Food was simple: grains, bread, and occasionally goat meat. Training consisted of prayers, discussions, and endless repetition of loyalty rituals. Few ever left, except on missions from which they might not return. The boredom of fortress life was a kind of prison, broken only by the dreadful anticipation of orders. What kind of person survived this environment? Not necessarily the strongest or most cunning, but often the most resigned. Loyalty was cultivated less by inspiration and more by the absence of alternatives. Many recruits knew they had nowhere else to go. To leave was betrayal. Betrayal meant death. Thus, they remained, caught in a cycle of waiting for commands, enduring suspicion, and surviving on meager resources. The idea that assassins lived dramatically dangerous lives hides the dull reality. Long stretches of inaction, punctuated by brief and terrifying violence. Imagine standing in a crowded market, watching a target pass by, your hand on a concealed dagger, waiting for the signal that might never come. Imagine months of gathering information, knowing that discovery meant excruciating punishment. The monotony of pretending to be ordinary, the fear of being caught, and the certainty of a violent end combined to make the assassin's life not thrilling but suffocating. And yet, despite these hardships, the Nizari assassins endured for nearly 2 centuries. Their network spanned from Persia to Syria, striking fear into far greater powers. But how did their missions actually unfold? Were they truly unstoppable shadows, or was their work plagued by blunders, mistakes, and desperate improvisations? Missions, methods, and the miserable reality of action. When you think of an assassin's mission, you might picture a clean strike, a dagger to the throat, a vial of poison slipped into a cup, or a dramatic leap from the shadows. The truth of medieval assassination, however, was far less elegant. To understand the life of these men during their missions, we must look beyond legend and examine the dull, difficult, and dangerous details of how the assassins of the Nizari sect carried out their work. The anatomy of a mission. A typical mission began with months, sometimes years, of preparation. Orders came from the leaders of the sect, often directly from the figure known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a title used by Crusader chroniclers to describe leaders like Hassan I-Sabah or his successors. The target might be a local governor, a Crusader baron, or a rival cleric. Identifying the target was often the easiest part. Reaching them was another matter entirely. Unlike mercenaries, assassins rarely stormed castles or fought in pitched battles. Their work was intimate, face-to-face, and almost always suicidal. The assassin would travel to the city where the target lived, often under disguise. He might pose as a merchant, a soldier seeking employment, or even a servant in the target's household. To maintain this cover, he had to blend seamlessly into the community. This meant observing local customs, learning dialects, and performing daily tasks, an exhausting performance of ordinary life that could stretch on indefinitely. The assassin's greatest weapon was not his dagger, but his patience. He might serve as a stable boy for months before being summoned to bring a horse to the target. He might live as a shopkeeper, waiting until his target came to market. The act of killing was not a moment of passion. It was the culmination of endless waiting. The tools of the trade. Popular imagination loves to give assassins exotic tools, hidden blades, throwing knives, or even early poisons. The historical record, however, suggests their equipment was astonishingly simple. The most common weapon was the dagger. Compact, concealable, and reliable, the dagger was the assassin's tool of choice. Poison was rarer, not because it was unknown, but because it was impractical. Delivering poison required access to food or drink, which was difficult for a stranger to achieve without raising suspicion. A quick thrust of a blade in a public space was, paradoxically, simpler. Moreover, a public assassination created maximum psychological impact. Witnesses spread the tale of the assassin's boldness, reinforcing the sect's reputation for fearlessness. Armor or elaborate disguises were equally uncommon. A bulky assassin was a suspicious one. Instead, they relied on appearing utterly unremarkable until the decisive moment, the moment of the strike. The moment of action was often brutally straightforward. Assassins typically attacked in broad daylight, in public, and without any plan for escape. The goal was not survival, but certainty. By striking openly, they ensured witnesses could confirm the target was dead. This boldness also reinforced their terrifying mystique. Who else but the followers of the Nizari sect would dare attack a powerful leader in front of his guards, knowing death was inevitable? Examples abound. In 1092, assassins killed Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, by approaching him disguised as a Sufi mystic and stabbing him in broad daylight. In 1175, another assassin struck down Reynald of Chatillon, a notorious Crusader lord, though he survived the initial attempt. Other victims included caliphs, sultans, and rival imams. The assassin rarely lived beyond this moment. Guards cut him down instantly, or crowds tore him apart. Yet the leaders of the sect valued certainty above survival. If one man's death could destabilize an empire, then the assassin's sacrifice was worth it. The crushing burden of failure. But not every mission succeeded. Many assassins were caught before they could strike. Some were exposed by careless words, others betrayed by nervous behavior, and still others recognized by informants. For those captured alive, the consequences were horrifying. Examples abound. In 1092, assassins killed Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, by approaching him disguised as a Sufi mystic and stabbing him in broad daylight. In 1175, another assassin struck down Reynaud of Chatillon, a notorious crusader lord, though he survived the initial attempt. Other victims included caliphs, sultans, and rival imams. The assassin rarely lived beyond this moment. Guards cut him down instantly, or crowds tore him apart. Yet the leaders of the sect valued certainty above survival. If one man's death could destabilize an empire, then the assassin's sacrifice was worth it. The crushing burden of failure. But not every mission succeeded. Many assassins were caught before they could strike. Some were exposed by careless words, others betrayed by nervous behavior, and still others recognized by informants. For those captured alive, the consequences were horrifying. Prisoners were interrogated with brutal torture, pulled apart, burned, or mutilated in attempts to extract information about their order. Survivors were paraded through cities before being executed in grotesque public displays. One chronicler describes captured assassins being flayed alive, their skins nailed to city gates as warnings. Even when they succeeded, assassins sometimes failed to achieve the political outcome intended. Killing a governor might create temporary chaos, but it could also provoke brutal retaliation against Ismaili communities. Entire villages suspected of harboring sympathizers were massacred. For the individual assassin, there was no comfort in this complexity. Whether he struck successfully or not, his fate was sealed. Death was inevitable. The myth versus the reality. Western chroniclers, particularly crusaders, often exaggerated the assassin's mystique. Tales spread of drugged gardens, of initiates shown false paradises to inspire loyalty, of shadowy rituals. These stories, though colorful, tell us more about the fears of outsiders than about the daily reality of the assassins themselves. In reality, assassins were not magical killers, but desperate men bound by obedience and circumstance. Their missions were slow, nerve-wracking affairs. They had no guarantee of success, no hope of returning home, and no real reward beyond the approval of their leaders and the promise of spiritual salvation. The supposed glamour of the mission was undercut by constant fear, fear of discovery, fear of hesitation, fear of dying without accomplishing the task. Unlike mercenaries who could spend their earnings, or knights who gained honor in battle, assassins left behind nothing but a corpse and a whispered rumor. The broader context, why assassinations mattered. Despite the miserable lives of individual assassins, their work had an outsized effect. In an age of fragile political alliances, the removal of a single leader could tilt the balance of power. A dead vizier might paralyze an empire's bureaucracy. A slain crusader lord might alter the defense of a fortress. For their enemies, the fear of assassination was almost as effective as the act itself. Rulers wasted resources on elaborate security measures, rotating sleeping chambers, avoiding public appearances, or hiring layers of bodyguards. The mere threat of assassination shaped diplomacy and warfare, even if few actual assassins ever succeeded. This disproportionate influence was both the strength and weakness of the sect. Their terror relied on reputation, not numbers. But that reputation was built on the backs of expendable men, men whose lives were defined by waiting, fear, and death, living as a shadow. To imagine the assassin's experience, picture yourself as one of these men. You arrive in a bustling Syrian city, sent to infiltrate the household of a crusader baron. You take work as a servant, scrubbing floors, carrying water, fetching food. For months, nothing happens. You watch, you wait, you try to learn his habits. You sleep poorly, fearing discovery. You eat poorly, surviving on scraps. Every day stretches into the next, identical, meaningless, until at last, the order comes. Tomorrow, during the morning procession, you are to strike. You know you will die. Perhaps you will be cut down before you reach him. Perhaps you will stab him, only to be hacked to pieces by guards. Perhaps your blow will miss. None of it matters. Your life is already over. This was the true reality of being an assassin. A long, dull road to an inevitable death. The seeds of decline. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, the assassin's power began to wane. Larger empires grew less vulnerable to isolated killings, and the Mongol invasions crushed many of their fortresses. Yet the image of the assassin endured, reshaped into myth by their enemies and later by storytellers. Still, behind the myths lay the harsh truth. Assassins were not free agents of chaos, but men trapped by obedience, boredom, and despair. Motivations, cultural context, and the decline of the assassins. To fully understand why men kept becoming assassins despite the boredom, fear, and near certainty of death, we must step back into the cultural and political world of the medieval Middle East. Only then do the pieces begin to fit together. How desperation, belief, and circumstance drew ordinary men into one of the most dangerous roles history has ever recorded. Why join? The social roots of assassination. The first and simplest reason was lack of alternatives. In the 11th and 12th centuries, large swathes of Persia and Syria were racked by war, famine, and displacement. The collapse of old dynasties, the arrival of the Crusaders, and the pressure of Seljuk Turkish rule created widespread instability. For young men without family wealth, joining a powerful sect could mean the difference between starvation and survival. The Nizari Ismailis offered food, shelter, and community. Their mountain fortresses like Alamut, Lamassar, and Masyaf provided secure refuges at a time when most villages were vulnerable to raids and taxes. A recruit gained not only material support, but also a place to belong in a chaotic world. For others, the pull was religious. The Nazaris were a Shura sect who followed a distinct branch of Ismailism. They believed in the authority of a hidden imam, whose representative, the Da'i, missionary, or the fortress leader, guided them. Joining the sect wasn't just an act of desperation. For many, it was a path to spiritual salvation. In this light, becoming an assassin wasn't about chasing glory. It was about embracing a duty. Leaders like Hassanai Sabah framed missions as acts of ultimate loyalty, promising recruits a place in paradise. When every sermon, every ritual, and every leader reinforced the idea that death in service was the highest honor, recruits saw obedience not as sacrifice, but as salvation. Indoctrination and loyalty. The assassin's legendary loyalty wasn't created overnight. It was the result of careful indoctrination. Life inside the fortress was monotonous but structured. Daily prayers, scriptural study, and rituals drilled obedience into every recruit. Leaders emphasized the sanctity of missions, turning even mundane waiting into a spiritual exercise. Medieval chroniclers, especially crusaders, spread lurid tales of how this loyalty was cultivated. They claimed the old man of the mountain drugged his followers with hashish, transported them to artificial gardens full of women, and convinced them they had tasted paradise. According to these stories, recruits returned eager to die, believing they would regain paradise after their mission. Modern historians largely dismiss these accounts as propaganda. There is no solid evidence of drug-induced training or fake paradises. Instead, the truth was probably more ordinary. Long exposure to authority, ritual reinforcement, and the psychological weight of isolation. Recruits inside mountain fortresses were cut off from outside influences. Over time, loyalty wasn't a choice, but the only available worldview. And once you were in, there was no easy way out. Leaving the sect was considered betrayal. Betrayal meant certain death, either by execution within the fortress or by pursuit if you fled. The system bound recruits as tightly as chains. The paradox of power and weakness. The assassin's strength lay in their ability to terrify larger powers. With only a few thousand followers scattered across fortresses, they could not field armies against the Seljuks, Crusaders, or later the Mongols. Instead, they relied on psychological warfare. Killing a single vizier or crusader baron could sow more fear than an army of thousands. But this same reliance on fear exposed their weakness. Each mission required men to sacrifice themselves. Every successful strike drained their limited pool of loyal followers. Their reputation grew even as their resources dwindled. Over time, this imbalance became unsustainable. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, they survived by striking carefully chosen targets. When the Seljuk Empire grew too oppressive, they killed its vizier. When crusader leaders threatened their strongholds, they struck at them too. Their enemies learned that brute force could not eliminate the Nazaris without significant cost. This uneasy balance allowed them to survive far longer than one might expect from such a small, vulnerable group. Famous encounters and misunderstandings. The assassin's reputation reached as far as Europe. Crusaders carried stories of their boldness back to France, England, and beyond. Chroniclers like William of Tyre and Joinville painted them as mysterious, fanatical killers. One of the most famous encounters came in the 12th century, when the great Muslim leader Saladin faced assassination attempts by Nizari agents. According to chroniclers, Saladin awoke one night in his tent to find assassins had infiltrated his camp. Though he survived, the attempt left him deeply wary. He increased his guard, avoided predictable sleeping quarters, and negotiated peace with the Nizaris rather than risk further attacks. European leaders were equally cautious. Chroniclers record stories of Richard the Lionheart allegedly negotiating with the assassins, though these accounts are muddled by myth. What matters is not the accuracy of the tales, but the perception. To rulers across the Middle East and Europe, the assassins were a force to be respected, if not feared. Yet the irony remained. The very men who created this aura of terror lived miserable, short lives, often forgotten even by their own order. Their sacrifice built legends, but their names rarely survived. Decline and destruction. The end of the assassins came not with dramatic battles, but with the overwhelming force of empire. By the 13th century, the Nizari strongholds had survived Seljuks and Crusaders, but they could not withstand the Mongols. In 1256, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, marched into Persia with vast armies. He systematically besieged and destroyed the Nizari fortresses. Even Alamut, long considered impregnable, fell. The Mongols used engineers, siege engines, and sheer numbers to crush resistance. The assassin strategy of selective killing meant little against an empire that responded with overwhelming violence. In Syria, remnants of the sect held out longer, often negotiating with crusaders or Mamluks for survival. But by the late 13th century, their power had largely evaporated. The myth of the assassins lived on, but their actual communities were shattered, scattered, or absorbed into larger political systems. The legacy of boredom and fear. Looking back, what strikes us most is the contrast between myth and reality. To outsiders, the assassins were shadowy figures, masters of deception and fear. To the men themselves, the life was one of isolation, monotony, and terror. They waited endlessly for orders, disguised themselves as ordinary men, and carried daggers for missions they knew would cost them their lives. The legacy of the assassins is not just in the fear they spread, but in the way their story has been retold. Later centuries romanticized them as precursors to secret societies, spies, or even modern intelligence agencies. Yet the truth is more mundane, and therefore more unsettling. The assassins remind us how desperation and belief can shape lives into instruments of power, even when those lives were dull, short, and expendable. Reflection: why it truly sucked. So why did it suck to be a medieval assassin? Not because of the daggers or the missions. That part was brief. It sucked because of the long stretches of waiting disguised as someone else, the fear of betrayal or exposure, the inevitability of a violent death, and the lack of recognition even in success. These men endured crushing boredom, suffocating obedience, and the knowledge that their lives would end not in honor or wealth, but in a forgotten alley or a crowded square. And yet, their existence changed history. Viziers fell, crusader lords trembled, and sultans negotiated peace because of them. The assassins remind us that even the most ordinary, tedious lives, spent in waiting, hiding, and fearing, can ripple outward into events that shape empires. It is a strange paradox. Their lives were miserable and dull, but their legacy continues to capture the imagination centuries later. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, that the men who spent their lives blending into the crowd became unforgettable in history's memory.